Thorfinn, Thorfinn, open your eyes, Thorfinn. Wake up, Thorfinn. As he lies on the verge of death, the people Thorfinn slaughtered appear in front of his eyes. Vinland Saga, Chapter 216, Thousand-Year Voyage, Part 25. So, with last chapter, Einar's first kill kind of marked the climax of the fort siege, so I felt it was time for the story to return to Thorfinn's perspective, and as you can see, that's exactly what we're doing here. Shortly after the siege began, Polmuk came to ask Misekwe for his help in treating Thorfinn, so I expected this to lead to Thorfinn's first opportunity to talk with Misekwe, and finally bring him to realize his mistake and how he contributed to war and violence. I anticipated this to be a very significant moment for him, the sadness and pain from the weight of what he has done finally hitting him. Ultimately, this would lead to the two of them, alongside Hild, Polmuk, and Niska, finally being on the same page and seeking peace together. So with my expectations out of the way, let's begin the read-through. Thorfinn sees the people he has killed, both directly and indirectly, before him. Rather than seeing them as sad, walking corpses pulling him into oblivion, Thorfinn sees them as the people they were, momentarily awakened from the peaceful slumber he has brought them here. Still, Thorfinn recognizes who they are, and he believes he knows why they have come to him once more. Thorfinn laments. Despite how hard he tried, he has failed. Despite how well things seemed to be going, he was not able to put them to rest in the peaceful Vinland he promised them. He apologizes for keeping them waiting, and accepts that this is his end. He asks to be taken to Helheim or Valhalla, whichever is right for him. Regardless of his efforts towards redemption he has spent so much more of his life contributing to, he is ready to accept the judgment laid on him. However, this is not why his victims have returned to him. The soldier with the feather helmet, the man Thorfinn killed in the very first chapter to earn a duel with Askeladd, speaks to him. He tells Thorfinn that the Frider cenotaph he placed at the beginning of the arc has fallen, and that he must raise it once more. What Thorfinn has done here in Vinland was no failure, because by setting sail, he has begun a long journey. The ship has set out on a 1,000-year voyage. Along the way, there is nothing to see and nothing to fear. You just need to start rowing. Thorfinn ponders on these words, a voyage of 1,000 years. His victims leave him once more, telling him that they are relying on him for a monument to peace. And now, he must wake up. Thorfinn comes to, seeing Niskwaji above him calling his name. Thorfinn appears in poor condition, his face worn, his facial hair growing out, his hair disheveled, but he is alive. Niska runs out, calling to Misekwe to tell him that Thorfinn has finally woken up. Thorfinn looks to his worn hand and places it over his mouth, in shock that he's still alive. He repeats to himself, "I'm alive," before the realization hits him with a wave of adrenaline. Niska returns to the camp with Misekwe and Polmuk to see Thorfinn dragging himself out into the snow. She tries to tell him not to move, but he frantically asks how many days he has been unconscious. Still, Thorfinn cannot help but take personal responsibility for everything going wrong in Vinland. He cannot lay down while war continues and lives are lost. Niska can't keep up with him, asking him to speak slower so she can understand, and Misekwe watches, impressed that Thorfinn managed to pull through after taking 6 arrows. Behind him, Polmuk smiles from relief his effort to find help worked. From the tree line, Hild appears with a freshly killed rabbit, calling Thorfinn's name, relieved and thankful that her friend has woken up. Thorfinn desperately tries to communicate his worries to Hild, but she asks him to calm down and eat. The group gathers around the fire, preparing a rabbit stew. Hild explains that they are in camp where Misekpukwe had been hiding, that it had been 6 days and a half since Thorfinn collapsed. She thought he was done for. Not only were the arrow wounds deep, but one of them was poisoned. Throughout these 6 days, he was barely conscious, and they managed to keep him drinking and taking medicine. Misekpukwe and Nisquatchy provided an antidote and treated Thorfinn the whole time, and Pulamuk brought everything from food to furs to the pot they're cooking with. Without their efforts, without the goodwill and kindness Thorfinn had shown them from the start, he would not be alive. Thorfinn looks at Misekpukwe, surprised to see that this same man who demanded he leave Vinland had now come to save his life. Thorfinn thanks them, showing his respect by saying it from his limited Ulnu vocabulary and appreciating that they would risk infection from the plague to do so. Niska translates this to Misekpukwe and he responds, saying that it is thanks to the protection of the Great Spirit that they have not become infected, just as it is the Great Spirit who saved his life, not Misekpukwe himself. Hild continues to explain the situation to Thorfinn, telling him that the Ulnu army has remained surrounding the fort for these 6 days. She scouted yesterday, and although the Ulnu army was still active, there were no major battles. Still, she could not get to the fort, so she was not able to tell their people that Thorfinn had survived. Thorfinn looks down in a pained disappointment, realizing that they didn't end up leaving like he asked, Einar's disagreement with him likely echoing in his mind. Hild continues, although they possibly wouldn't leave, she also suggests that they may have been unable to leave, or that they may have been waiting for Thorfinn's return. This causes the adrenaline of responsibility to shoot Thorfinn to his feet once more, saying they must go immediately. But this burst of energy quickly gives way to disorientation. He is in no condition to be moving. Hild reiterates this concern to him. Although she understands his feelings, he needs to get food in his stomach and wait the night at the very least. Thorfinn struggles to accept this. While he rests, people continue to die, and the more people die, the further the day of reconciliation. With Niska's translation, Thorfinn's words rouse Misekpukwe from his silence. He asks Thorfinn if, even at this point, he still thinks reconciliation is possible. Thorfinn confirms this with no doubts. Reconciliation can always be done at any time should they choose to. Strife must always end in a settlement. Misekpukwe is at first put off by the contradiction of Thorfinn's prior agreement to leave Vinland and his current insistence on reconciliation, asking if the former was a lie. Thorfinn tries to explain himself, saying that he understands that when things go wrong, it is best to give distance. Considering the conflict was caused by the disease as far as Thorfinn is aware, he tells Misekpukwe that he intends to travel the earth looking for a cure, and eventually return once he found it. Even if they were to leave, be forced out, Thorfinn insists on not giving up on the idea of coexistence and takes the responsibility for curing the disease onto himself. Still, Misekpukwe does not accept this idea, saying that coexistence is not possible, not only because of the plague, but because their way of living and the spirits they revere are different. Here, Misekpukwe finally drops the mask of the disease, a problem that certainly contributed to his decisions, but was merely the final straw on top of his original fears that the Norse way of life cannot coexist alongside their own. The disease is certainly a real problem that he believes in. It's not something he used as a means to an end, but he is dismissing it to talk about the real concerns he has had from the very beginning. Polemuk interrupts to cut through this argument though, telling him that they were doing just fine until he brought violence onto them. Niska is a bit hesitant at the bluntness of Polemuk's blame on Msekbekwe, but he continues. He says that as he saw entire families lost to the illness, he too hated the Nords for a moment and thought it would be better if they were gone. But that momentary hatred vanished immediately because he knows they are not bad guys. Although he greatly values his people and felt personal responsibility for the disease, this would not simply turn him against these people he had befriended and been treated so well by up until that point. Thorfinn's eyes light up hearing this, surprised at the grace Polemuk is giving him despite what they unwillingly brought onto his people. Polemuk leans down to Msekbekwe and says, "Puowin, look well at the man in front of you. With your own eyes, he was nearly killed by Usulnu and badly wounded, but he still wants to mend things with us. What does this man look like to you? Is he someone you could not coexist with? Before using the mysteries of the spirits, you thought we should make friends with the Nords, didn't you?" Here, Polemuk tries to break through Msekbekwe's pre-existing fears, break through the things his ritual showed him, and ask him to simply judge the man before him with his own eyes, to look not at what he fears the man will do, but at what the man has shown himself to be. Msekbekwe remains silent, and the state of their current situation and Polemuk's words clash within his mind. Thorfinn breaks the silence. "Let's be friends. It's not too late yet," Msekbekwe speaks. "It is too late. I called the warriors down on you." For the first time, Msekbekwe takes responsibility for this mistake, but if Polemuk's words are true, then he has surely voided the chance of coexistence himself by now. But Thorfinn replies, with a gentle smile on his face, "But you saved me." Msekbekwe insists, we are each other's enemy. Regardless of the current feelings of Thorfinn or even himself, there is no going back from the damage that has been done. Thorfinn replies with an absolute declaration, "No, I have no enemies." These words break through to Msekbekwe, and he shoots to his feet. What Thorfinn has just said echoes the way of the Great Spirit, teachings that Msekbekwe reveres and has dedicated his life to. For a moment, his gaze on Thorfinn remains stern, hesitant. How strange it is to hear the mysteries of the spirits from the mouth of a Nord. He raises his head for a deep breath, his face strained with the realization he has come to, before lowering his head in defeat. "All right. It is as you say, Polemuk. I knew the Nords only through the mysteries. I was mistaken. Now, here, this moment, this chance meeting is eternity." And that ends the chapter. So, immediately, I have to talk about the 1,000-year voyage stuff. This has been something I have been very, very focused on since the start of this arc. Immediately when we got chapter 192 with the first 1,000-year voyage part, I really latched onto that name and I wanted to understand what the story was getting at. Over time, as we got continued chapters about 1,000-year voyage and we continue to explore how this relates to what we saw from Msekbekwe with the Sight of the Future and Thorfinn's discussion with Vargar about Ragnarok in the following chapter, all of this fed into my understanding of 1,000-year voyage and the How Vinland Saga Will End video that I ended up making. This moment here perfectly serves to reaffirm what I expected this arc to be. So, for the first time since the arc began, Thorfinn sees his past victims again, and we hear the name of the arc finally stated in the text itself. As always, the supernatural is used by the story for thematic, meta-narrative purposes, and this should not be taken literally as Thorfinn seeing these people and their spirits being real. Still though, this is, as always, a great glimpse into Thorfinn's current mindset and the direction this arc aims to go in. So among the victims is the feather helmet French general Thorfinn was sent to kill in the very first chapter, as well as the Englishwoman who took Thorfinn in during the prologue. I don't recognize the others, but these are all people Thorfinn has either killed himself or through his actions enabled the killing of. For example, with the child here, I don't think even prologue Thorfinn would have directly killed a child, but he certainly would have allowed it to happen, or at the very least would not have gone out of his way to make sure his actions don't cause it. And the Feather Helmet General being so significant here, makes me think that the main corpse we saw Thorfinn interact with during the Valhalla dream back in the farm arc might actually be this same man. Which is very fitting considering this is, one of the first major kills Thorfinn has. He wasn't exactly a character, but this is the first really focused on kill. This is a person Thorfinn killed simply because it would lead to a duel with Askeladd. So, him being given this significance here makes me think that Yukimura may have also had him in mind back when he wrote that farm arc scene as well. Now, usually when Thorfinn sees his victims, he sees them as corpses, dragging him down to punish him. Now, he sees them as the people that they were, now awoken from the peaceful slumber he managed to grant them. While before he could not recognize the people he has killed, he's now able to look at them with clarity, no longer tormented, no longer subconsciously blocking the memory out either. They have let him go. He's climbed to the top of the chasm, but his work is not done. So, poetically, it is the victim from the very first chapter that delivers the theme of the arc to Thorfinn here. Thorfinn's attempt at true peace in Vinland, the way he hoped for, has not worked. But, by setting sail, he has begun a long journey that will outlast even himself. On that 1,000-year voyage, there is nothing to see or fear, he just needs to start rowing. To simply try to begin the voyage in earnest and continue to row undaunted by fear and pessimism for the future, failure will never be final. Thorfinn must wake up to continue the voyage here. And 1,000 years later, as we are reading this chapter, as his voyage nears its conclusion, we will continue to row too. The final words they say to him here as well, "We are relying on you for a monument to peace," reaffirms my hope that the final page of the story will show his cenotaph being recovered in the modern day, his monument to peace, delivering his dream to the future, the end of his voyage and the beginning of ours. Now, when Thorfinn wakes up, we learn that it has been 6.5 days since he has collapsed. So with the story jumping ahead to Thorfinn's recovery, a lot of questions are raised. Again, it was said to be 6.5 days since Thorfinn collapsed. We saw 2 days of the fort siege after that until the end of last chapter. So about 4 more days have passed since then. This raises great suspense since we cannot be certain about what has happened since Vargar returned, with the question of continued evacuation still in the air. As I have been saying for quite a bit now, I expect the Norse will not be willing to stop now that so much damage has been done to them, and they will choose to take the offensive when the opportunity comes. Now, Hild has said there have been no major battles when she scouted out the previous day. Although we see healthy new warriors from her perspective here, we can see that the army has stopped gathering in the Norse homes and have erected their own individual tents here. This indicates to me that disease has likely begun to spread in their ranks, an opportunity that the Norse will not want to waste should they become aware of it. it seems very likely to me that the next time we see Einar and the Norse, it will be at the beginning of their offensive. But speaking of Hild, a disappointing aspect of the jump forward in time for me is the fact that we did not really get to see the initial moments of Misekpekwe being brought to help Thorfinn. I would have liked to see the beginning of the treatment process and any hesitance that Misekpekwe may have had. More importantly, I would have liked to see how Hild interacts on her own with them, considering she had been resolved to assassinate Misekpekwe herself not long before this. That choice she made had already dissipated in importance once Thorfinn agreed to leave Vinland. So her impact and agency in the story has kind of gone down a bit since then. Even if she ultimately didn't go through with that assassination, I would have liked to see that choice be given more weight now that she is confronted with this man's presence. Yukimura actually does this idea very well with Pulmuk this chapter instead. When the disease was first shown to have impacted the Gitpi tribe and the chief passed away, I really latched on to Pulmuk's desperation and self-blame, and expected that to really impact him and contribute towards an eventual escalation to violence that he is forced to participate in. Now, I did not think it would turn him immediately against his own friends, but I wanted those feelings he was clearly having to really matter for his character. Here, in this chapter, the expectation I had is used very well for subversion. Rather than those feelings being ignored, they are brought up again to show Pulmuk's trust in his friends and resolve to surpass those momentary fears. Like with Hild, those momentary feelings did not end up leading to violence from him, but they are still given weight and purpose for his character. So I am hopeful that the same will happen for Hild later. However, like with Einar, I believe these ideas are still being planted with the intent of having them resurface later when the violence eventually reaches him and his tribe personally, and he is forced to make difficult choices. As of now, Pulmuk hasn't properly been confronted with the conflict of, should I make the Norse leave in order to protect my people, because he hasn't been put in that position directly yet. He's still able to see the silver lining. But what about when he is put in a situation like Einar? What about when he stands to lose something? What is he going to do? Now, the conversation with Misekpekwe. Finally, this highly anticipated moment has come, but unfortunately, I do have some mixed feelings. So before I get too negative, I do want to talk about something that I found pretty interesting, and that's Thorfinn saying that he would travel the world to find a cure before returning, and that he ultimately did not plan to give up on the idea of coexistence here in Vinland with these same people. Now, this is obviously very in character. Thorfinn can't help but take personal responsibility for everything that goes wrong on his watch, and the disease is no different. This is a very hopeful and idealistic perspective. He would journey across the whole world if that's what it will take, with no concern for the idea that such a thing may not exist, or that he may die in search of it and never return to Vinland. This is very strong thematically, as it acts as an answer to Knut's question of what would Thorfinn do when he was confronted with disease in chapter 202. And the answer is just as absurdly sincere as Knut would expect from Thorfinn, and an answer I'm sure he never would have thought of himself. Still though, Thorfinn insisting on eventually returning does feel a bit flawed. One of the most important criteria for them coming to Vinland was that they do so with the approval of the native people. So, to be told to leave, but to continue to insist on returning, may come off as stubbornly not taking no for an answer. Of course, from Thorfinn's perspective, the war is due to disease, So if he solves that problem, then nobody has to lose. And if there are more problems after that, he will relentlessly solve them the same way until all necessary concessions have been made by him. However, this is the first time Thorfinn's philosophy has brought him to a conclusion I find a bit questionable. Sometimes it really is best to accept that continuously trying to solve things will only serve to dig the hole deeper. That is a mistake I know I make a lot when it comes to accidentally hurting someone and wanting to make things better. He is right that when things go wrong, it's good to get distance. But sometimes you really shouldn't continue to close that distance again and again in an attempt to make it better. And this roots back into Thorfinn's biggest character flaw that we have seen since his redemption, his tendency to stubbornly take every problem on by himself because he always feels personal responsibility and blame for anything that goes wrong. This is not a problem with the chapter, by the way. It's just something I found very interesting and I wanted to talk about it. What I unfortunately did not like as much was the use of the "no enemies" line. This may be due in part to how the phrase has become a bit of a meme, making it very overused and often misused in online spaces. When I read it, rather than it being the satisfying callback it's intended to be, it felt a bit forced in how the conversation was made to lead up to it, and how significant it ended up being to the resolution of this discussion. One of the common criticisms of Vinland Saga, which comes from a misunderstanding of the intent of the no enemies scene, is that the story is presenting this line as some magic phrase that will solve conflict on its own. You'll often see people online saying things like, "Oh, how are you gonna no enemies your way out of this one? How are you going to talk no jutsu your way out?" Obviously, this is not the message Vinland Saga intends to send in the slightest. It is well aware that conflict is far more complicated than that, and simply saying the phrase is not a solution in of itself, which makes the reliance on it here feel a bit overdone, like the line has become its own kind of self-contained cliche. Still though, this is actually the only other time Thorfinn has said it in the story since the original scene, so the feeling of it being overplayed and given too much weight in the dialogue may just be caused by my own exposure to it as a fan who is constantly participating in online discussion around the story. But on that point though, about how it was such an important part of resolving the conversation, I actually do really like the way it played into Mi'kmaq spirituality with Missepikwe. One thing I learned when doing research into the history of the Mi'kmaq nation is that their belief in a single creator, great spirit, was a point of overlap with Christian monotheistic beliefs that actually allowed Christian missionaries in colonial times to convert Mi'kmaq people more easily than other native tribes. And there are other tribes too that also kind of share some monotheistic traits in their spiritual beliefs, but native tribes were definitely not a monolith. They didn't all share the same beliefs, but this tribe, the Mi'kmaq people, is very notorious in history for this Christian overlap that ended up happening. Although Thorfinn is not directly preaching Christianity, his beliefs do mirror Christianity and this greater teaching of loving one's enemy, having no enemies. So having this core philosophy passed down by Thorfinn's father mesh well with the spiritual beliefs of Missepikwe, ones that he believed separates them, is a great idea thematically and acts as a nice nod to the real historical significance of this unlikely sharing of beliefs between two groups of people. So I think what ultimately contributes to my slight disappointment in how this conversation went was just how subdued the climactic moment was for Missepikwe. Before, I was comparing my anticipation for this scene to something like Olmar admitting his cowardice. That was a kind of smaller climax for Olmar's arc in the farm arc. It wasn't the climax of the whole arc, but it was a very good payoff of his own regrets just collapsing in on him. I expected a strong stubbornness, which we did get a bit of here, alongside more difficulty in communication and defensiveness from him that eventually breaks down into an overwhelming of emotion after realizing his mistakes. What we got here, though, was a bit more streamlined. There was some great back and forth, but having the no enemies line immediately lead to this subdued admittance of being mistaken and then ending the chapter on it made it feel a bit lacking to me. That being said, I do not hate this. I don't even really dislike it. I think I'm just iffy on the execution compared to my expectations. To put a more positive spin on this, the choice to have his "I was mistaken" line be as subdued as it is can be seen as contributing to the tragedy of how simple of a realization it was, how easily it could have been done at any point should Msepikwe have just talked to Thorfinn. Also, there's still plenty of opportunity for a more emotionally rich moment from Msepikwe later on, especially if the war continues to become worse like we expect, and he must truly confront what he has brought onto both his people and Thorfinn's. So, overall, I had quite a few complaints, obviously, but this was still a great chapter to read, and did not take away from my expectations for the approaching climax at all. One thing that didn't come up in the analysis, though, was the art this chapter. Now, we had a lot of great new drawings, especially with the disheveled Thorfinn. It called for a lot more new art for him, but I also did notice a lot of art reuse. There is, this war panel here in the middle, and then there's also the disease panel from here. These are kind of just background panels. It's not really easy to notice its art reuse, and most of the time, when art is reused in Vinland, it is exactly like this. It's for moments where the flow of the panels make it easy to not really notice. It's the same thing for the occasional reuse of character expressions and slightly modified character art. But what I did notice here was in moments that really demand your full attention, that really bring your gaze to the characters. And a lot of this was with Msepikwe and his repeated reaction expressions. You see the same kind of panels for him pretty frequently in this chapter. I remember the shocked expression here. This is reused from when he first saw the disease had struck the Gitpi tribe. I remember that very well because I used it for a thumbnail. And I think this really just goes to show Msepikwe is a very detailed and difficult to draw character design, especially with his face. You have this panel here as well at the top. I don't believe this one's reused. I'm saying this one is, it's very detailed, and just goes to show he's a complicated character to draw. So I don't like to complain about art reuse, considering how hard Yukimura clearly works on every chapter. But I felt like this chapter could have really benefited from more impactful, unique expressions for Msepikwe that strongly convey the emotions of his current circumstances, of these realizations he's having, like we had with Einar last chapter. So, if every chapter recently has just been a solid 10 out of 10 for me, which they have, this is the first one in a while I put around a 9. It's not bad at all. That's the worst Vinland chapter I've ever read is better than many, many manga I've read as a whole. This series is very consistently good with every chapter. As much as I talked about negatives and disappointing aspects, this still just goes to show this story is relentless in setting the bar very high. And I am not really dissuaded at all in my confidence that the ending will be great. So, let's talk next chapter predictions. Now that Thorfinn and Misekukwe are united in this desire to seek peace, we will likely continue following their perspective next chapter and move towards the two perspectives, Einar at the fort and Thorfinn here, converging once again. With Hild's description of the state of the fort siege earlier in the chapter, I think it is very likely that the disease has begun to spread in the Mainelnu force, and should the Norse catch on to that, I expect it will be seen as an opportunity to counterattack and reestablish their control over the village. I also think it is very unlikely that they would have continued evacuation with Vargar's return. Since Vargar and his men were so critical to the defense of the fort, they would not want to risk being attacked without them again. So, I think we will see Thorfinn's group begin making their way to the fort after one more night of rest, like Hild recommended, and will find themselves in the midst of a Norse counterattack. If Thorfinn is not able to reach them until the attack has begun, then I do think we will need to go to Einar's perspective beforehand so we can see the Norse make this crucial decision. Either way, though, the collective desire for revenge that is built up in the Norse and the acceptance of there simply being no other choice will make this war continue to spiral out of Thorfinn's control. The next time he sees them again, sees Einar again, they will have been completely lost to the storm of violence, and that storm will continue to grow and engulf more lives in its path. So, we'll have to wait and see where this all goes. Doesn't look like we have a break next month, but it will be December. Yukimura, obviously, if you know anything about him as a person, he really values time with his family. So going into the holiday season, we may end up having a December break again, but as of now, such thing has not been announced, so we can still expect to get a chapter next month, but I'm keeping expectations in check for that one. But until then, thank you for watching.